Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
15 godina radio je na predmetima ratnih zločina na Balkanu. Osuđujuća presuda bivšim zvaničnicima Službe državne bezbjednosti Srbije Jovici Stanišiću i Franku Simatoviću stavila je tačku na haška suđenja za ratne zločine u bivšoj Jugoslaviji, ali i na jedno poglavlje u njegovoj karijeri i životu. Serge Brammertz, glavni tužilac Međunarodnog rezidualnog mehanizma za krivične sudove, za Al Jazeeru odgovara: imaju li žrtve pravo na odštetu nakon posljednje presude? Šta je najvažnije nasljeđe suda u Hagu? Kako ocjenjuje procesuiranje ratnih zločina u regiji i kako će o tome izvijestiti Vijeće sigurnosti UN-a?
Mr. Brammertz, thank you very much for joining Al Jazeera and talk to Al Jazeera.
Thank you for having me.
The final verdict in Stanišić and Simatović case closed a very important chapter in the mandate of mechanism. How do you feel about this verdict? Because they were not only jailed to 15 years in prison, they were also found guilty for the joint criminal enterprise.
Well, indeed, it was the last really important appeals decision coming out from the tribunal. So it was a last opportunity for the judges to really set the record straight and to confirm existing jurisprudence. And as you said, we have officers as the prosecutor are very satisfied with the result, not only because both have been convicted, but also because our appeal was successful. In first instance, both had been convicted, each to 12 years of imprisonment, but the judges were of the opinion that they were not part of the larger joint criminal enterprise. And this is really the most important element in these new judgments. The judges have confirmed that from Belgrade there was a very large joint criminal enterprise where Milosevic, Karadzic and others were part of, and now Stanišić, Simatović as well. And the objective of this joint criminal enterprise was to really create clean, ethnically clean territory in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in Croatia by exterminating, by removing massively non-Serbs from areas which were claimed as Serbs entities. In this sense, it is a very important decision. Both are now part of this joint criminal enterprise, but also the fact that it was confirmed again that leadership, political leadership, intelligence leadership, military leadership from Belgrade were involved in the wars in the former Yugoslavia. You know, very often we hear the argument, well, what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina was a civil war or was an internal armed conflict. This decision again very much confirms that political, military and intelligence leadership from Belgrade were involved in these operations. As we had some time ago in the Perlić case, where a number of Bosnian Croats were convicted for crimes and where the judges also concluded in appeal that there was a joint criminal enterprise from Zagreb, including the political leadership which was in charge then.
I know that mechanism does not have a task to deal with any kind of compensations, but as an international legal expert, do you believe that it's now possible for either victims or for Bosnia to seek any kind of compensation from Serbia?
Well, indeed, the victims are not directly part to the proceedings in order to claim reparation or compensation as you would have in domestic jurisdictions. Having said that, the victims and survivors have played a major role in all our cases. We had more than 5,000 victims, witnesses coming forward to testify to help us getting those convictions. I think the only possibilities victims and survivors have, as they're already doing, is to go to national courts to claim reparation compensation. We have seen this in other cases where there were convictions in The Hague, that those criminal convictions would be used in domestic proceedings in order to get reparations. Unfortunately, the UN Tribunal has no mandate and no authority in this area.
Do you think the victims should do that now? File claims in Bosnia?
Well, I really leave it to their lawyers to advise them on which, if proceedings have chances to be successful, and where to introduce those proceedings, before which jurisdictions, in which country. But I'm really not in a position, unfortunately, to give any advice on this.
Okay, so with this last final judgment in Mechanism, Stanišić and Simatović case, Mechanism has completed its task when it comes to prosecuting war crimes in former Yugoslavia. You have more than 160 indictments, if I'm not mistaken, 93 accused, 7 life sentences. What would you say is the most important legacy of both the Mechanism and the tribunal?
You know, when in '93 the ICTY was set up, it was the first time since the Nuremberg trials that the United Nations and the Security Council took an initiative of this nature. And when I speak with diplomats who were at the Security Council in the 90s, and they see today the achievement of the ICTY, they would all say unanimously that it really exceeds expectations, because no one would have expected that more than 160 people would be indicted, that more than 90 people would have been convicted during the lifetime of the tribunal and the mechanism. So I think it has played a very important role. A number of individuals who obviously were responsible for the wars, taking advantage of their positions, and who were responsible for massive killings of citizens in the region, well, they were taken out of the system and are serving prison sentences. And I think it's better where they are now than being still involved in politics in the former Yugoslavia. So I think we played a very important role, and we invested a lot in this transition now, even if we are finishing the work of the international tribunals, where there are still hundreds, if not to say thousands of cases which still need to be conducted at the domestic level. So what I want to say is that one chapter is over, the chapter of international criminal justice in The Hague in relation to the former Yugoslavia. But for many years to come, will we be in a position to support domestic investigations, which are not going as well as they should go.
I know you can't say much because you haven't presented it yet, but what are your main findings from your latest report to the UN Security Council?
We sent the report indeed in May, but it will only become public 12th of June when we are presenting the report to the Security Council. Well, definitely one of my big frustrations after having been in this job for 15 years is to see that the progress is not what we wanted to see. We do not see, for the majority of governments, the commitment necessary to really push accountability and those cases. If you look at the region, the sad reality is that hundreds of perpetrators who committed crimes in Bosnia-Herzegovina went to Serbia or to Croatia because of their double citizenship. And because of their national domestic constitutions, there is no extradition of their own nationals. Which means that there is a very large impunity gap still, where you have perpetrators who are just living a peaceful life a few kilometers away from the border, and they cannot be extradited. What we have tried over the last years is to really convince our colleagues in Bosnia-Herzegovina to transfer those cases to where the perpetrators physically are, to Croatia and to Serbia. But there we need to see a much stronger willingness to take those cases and to handle those cases. And I've been very critical about Croatia over the last 2 years, because there were more than 80 requests for assistance coming from Bosnia-Herzegovina in relation to those cases sent to Zagreb, and they were all blocked at the level of the Minister of Justice, never sent to the judicial authorities. And this for the last 6 years. So when I was 2 months ago in Zagreb, meetings with the Minister of Justice again, so this time I got the promise and the guarantees that all those requests for assistance finally would be executed. If this is indeed the case, this would be progress, because once those requests for assistance would be returned to Bosnia-Herzegovina, those cases could be moving forward. But it's still, there are still too few cases prosecuted in each country. We have criticized several times in Croatia that the majority of cases are cases in absentia against Serb perpetrators, where we want also to see more investigations against Croatian perpetrators, because while it's not our job to measure responsibility within the conflict, fact is that there have been victims on all sides, and there have been perpetrators from all sides. and countries, especially if they are members of the European Union, really should show the example and make sure that accountability is the rule and not the exception.
So dozens of cases in Croatia. What would you say that are the most notorious examples?
Well, I really don't want to mention very specific or individual cases because, you know, there's always a tendency to speak much more about the perpetrators and the importance of the perpetrators and much less about the victims which are behind those cases. So I'm always saying that, well, all cases are equally important because for the individual perpetrator, for the family who lost their loved ones, for a woman who has been raped, doesn't really make any difference if the commander was a very prominent individual or not.
But in Serbia, though, Novak Djokic, one of the most notorious examples, I would say, related to Tuzlanska Kapija massacre. How to stop that from happening when it comes to Serbia? Have you also spoken to Serbian officials, like you went to Zagreb?
Of course. And things are. I was in Belgrade 2 days before going to Zagreb. I had meetings with the president, I had meeting with the Minister of Justice, with the chief prosecutor, and we have a very constructive and a good cooperation. And we transferred a number of case files from our office to Belgrade. Our colleagues in Sarajevo also transferred now several cases to Belgrade, and we will see in the coming months if the prosecution officers are really successful in moving those cases forward, because the challenge is really, I understand that there's often a reluctance from victims and survivors in Bosnia-Herzegovina to say, well, we go to testify in a criminal case in Belgrade or in Zagreb, feeling uncomfortable about it. And the most important is that they have to believe that what colleagues in Belgrade and Zagreb are doing is serious and meaningful. That's why we are still watching Belgrade and Zagreb, and we want to see how successful those prosecutions are, because if they are not successful, well, I think authorities in Sarajevo will be very reluctant in transferring more cases to those two other capitals.
What about Bosnia? Because Bosnia pledged to solve all the war crimes cases until the end of 2023, but it's not likely to complete its task.
Yeah. You know, I understand that you always need to have a war crime strategy and you have to put deadlines, right? But I think it was obvious to everyone that when the deadline was set, that it was impossible to get there. I think, don't have now the exact figures, but I think there are almost 300 important cases still pending. They relate to more than 3,000 individuals. I mean, no jurisdiction can handle 3,000 investigations within 3 or 4 years. So I think it was clear that this deadline could not be met. We work very well with the chief prosecutor and his team in Sarajevo. We also transferred a number of cases there. We are receiving more than 150 requests for assistance from our colleagues in Bosnia-Herzegovina. It's absolutely the prosecution office we have the most intense cooperation with, and where we also organize on a regular basis training activities together. So while I'm still critical about all prosecution officers in the region, I recognize that there are many good prosecutors in all three countries who are really trying to push this agenda forward. But I'm not always convinced that they have the necessary political support to do so. And as long as you see politicians glorifying war criminals, denying genocide, I mean, it's not really the right signal if you want to see prosecutions being successful.
That was my next question, because one of the main contributions of both the tribunal and the mechanism is the international recognition of genocide and other war crimes, but we see them being denied in the region despite the genocide denial ban in Bosnia.
Yeah.
What do you see as a solution to this problem?
Well, the problem obviously is not getting away. The problem, I think, is getting worse. And what I'm always saying is that, in fact, genocide denial is the final phase of the commission of the genocide. When the genocide crime is committed, it's about destroying an entire population for what they are. And genocide denial is then trying to destroy even the memory about not only the crimes but also about those people. So for the survivors of genocide, is the most insulting attitude one can have is to really deny their victimhood as genocide victims or sometimes survivors. Now, personally, I'm very much in favor of legislation which is punishing genocide denial. But we also know that punishment, like for other crimes, is not the only or the best solution. The only good solution is really to change mentalities, to convince people about it. And of course, the genocide denial is very much linked to the glorification of war criminals. And what I like to say in this area is always to say, well, those people are not heroes. They have not defended their own people or saved women and children. All of them have been prosecuted and convicted, internationally or domestically, because they were violating the Geneva Conventions, meaning they were massively killing civilians, they were executing prisoners, they were ordering their soldiers to use rape as a weapon of war. So all those individuals are the absolute opposite of heroes. And this is really one of the challenges we still have to make this understanding to the larger public.
But it's not only about the feelings. You say it's very insulting for the victims. It's something that should be punished according to the law in Bosnia, because now we have this imposed genocide denial ban. But despite that fact, we still have 0 indictments in Bosnia for genocide denial. How to solve this problem legally?
Yeah. I mean, I understand that there are a number of cases which have been opened. I will be there in July, and of course I will ask this question to the chief prosecutor. The legislation is still quite recent. I understand that there are a number of conditions which need to be met. I understand that there are discussions about the legislation as such, if it needs to be amended or not in order to be applicable. But I'm not close enough to this specific discussion to offer a solution.
I understand. Now when this mandate of the mechanism is closed, I would like to ask you, because you've been prosecutor since 2008 in the tribunal, what is your personal and professional reflection? What is your main takeaway, both professionally and personally, after these 15 years, if I'm not mistaken?
Yeah, 15 years in this function, and then before 15 years at the ICC in Lebanon or in Belgium. You know, I think from a professional perspective, it's really a privilege to be able to do a job where you can make the difference in the life of people, right? So it's sometimes difficult. Our investigations are not easy. There are a lot of political obstacles, but when you have a result like yesterday, or I remember the days when Karadzic or Mladic were arrested, and I was meeting with the mother of Srebrenica or other victims organizations, and you see what it means in the life of survivors and victims. This is really when we really fully understand that it's a privilege to have a function like ours. And I have a fantastic team we are working with, and yeah, it's I think for a lawyer and a prosecutor, being able to make a difference in the life of people is important.
What would you say was your hardest task in these 15 years? What was your main challenge?
When I came in 2008, you know, to replace Carla Del Ponte, the discussion was, will the tribunal close before Karadzic and Mladic are arrested, right? So the biggest challenge, I would say, in the first year when I came in was really to make all the reforms necessary in the office and in tracking fugitives and in cooperation with Belgrade to make this possible. I would say the most difficult was really the first 2 years when I came in. But yeah, I mean, it's as I said, it's a great team. I started with 500 staff members. Now there are only 100 left in our different offices, because, as you know, we have also this office in Arusha. I'm also in charge of the remaining functions for the Rwanda Tribunal, where we had last week also this very important success a fugitive arrested who had been on the run for 20 years, allegedly responsible for killing more than 2,000 women and children who found refuge in a church, throwing hand grenades into the church and then using very heavy machinery to have the church collapsing over them. So this was also a major success for our office and for my team. And having met the survivors only a few months ago, I know again what it means for them. And of course, to see what it means gives you personally a very great professional satisfaction.
With former Yugoslavia, we do report about cases and indictments and verdicts a lot in the Balkans, but not much about Arusha, even though it's the same court. So what else do you have to do? What are your steps ahead?
Well, personally, I'm spending half of my time in both places for the last 5 years since I'm also in charge of the mechanism. And there, we in fact repeated the successes in terms of arresting the remaining fugitives, because when I took over 5 years ago, there were still 8 fugitives at large in relation to the Rwanda genocide. Well, we closed 5 of those cases over the last 3 years. So we used partially similar methodologies we have used to get Karadzic and Mladic and others arrested. We repeated them in a very different context. But what I would say is that the brutality of perpetrators on the European or African continent is very, very similar, and the suffering of the victims as well. And of course, from a more psychological perspective, it's still for me so difficult to understand in the former Yugoslavia, but also in Rwanda, what must happen to a normal individual who had been a teacher, a police officer, and then suddenly to become a mass murderer. What kind of brainwash must take place by whoever is the political or military leader? What needs to take place in terms of manipulation to convince an individual to kill their neighbors just because they are different? This remains also after 30 years in my profession a very, very difficult question to answer.
Yes, and a very, very big question indeed. You just said, even though it's 2 different continents, it's 2 different cultural contexts, but still some similarities in terms of the atrocities. Would you say that the problem of denial of crimes also exists in Rwanda, like in former Yugoslavia?
It's very, very similar, and I took the initiative to organize in October at the Nuremberg Academy. You know Nuremberg, where the Nuremberg trials took place after the Second World War. So with a few colleagues and the Nuremberg Academy, we are organizing in October a conference on genocide denial in the courtroom 600 where the Nazi trials took place. And I've invited victims and academics and prosecutors from the former Yugoslavia and from Rwanda, because they never were together at any forum, because I think the problems are very, very similar. We speak about 2 very different genocides, but they're all suffering from the same genocide denial. And we see the same reactions by survivors and victims when we are successful in getting an arrest or getting a conviction, because we of course know that it will never bring back their loved ones, but it really gives them a feeling of justice being done. So we, as I said now several times, it's really good to be in a function like ours, and I'm absolutely sure that this feeling is shared by many of my colleagues. To be international prosecutor, doing international investigations is for us much more rewarding to be working in a private practice or in an insurance company, which is also very, very important. I'm not diminishing, but I think in terms of job satisfaction, working in the job we have, if successful, is very rewarding.
I mean, the other day after the final verdict in Stanišić and Simatović case, I've seen Srebrenica survivors hugging you in front of the court, and it seems that you've connected to people in these 15 years as a prosecutor in a tribunal and mechanism. So how do you feel about everything on a personal level? This is a very important career, but how has it impacted you on a personal level?
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult question, because as a prosecutor you really try to keep feelings outside your job because you want really to keep your impartial, objective, independent opinion on everything you are doing. But being impartial doesn't mean you cannot have sympathies and connections to individuals. And of course, Munira Subasic and many of her sisters, after so many years, we are quite close. And I think they trust us and know that we are, my entire team and myself, somehow their spokesperson at the international level. And believe me, when I have meetings with them, they can be extremely tough, as the survivors in Rwanda are. Mm-hmm. And very often after a very engaged discussion, they apologize afterwards to say, sorry, we have been too loud, we have to been emotional. And I'm always telling them, look, you are the only persons in the world who can shout at me, or even, well, not insulting, but you can shout at me and be very loud and very, very critical, because you are the reason why we are here, you are the reason why this tribunal was set up, and you have to push us every time to continue doing our job, because the United Nations and the international community failed you by preventing those crimes. The minimum we could do is try to help you getting justice. And I really believe that the victims and survivors believe us when we are saying that we are 100% committed in helping them. Having said that, you know, of course, the mothers are probably the organization I'm the closest to. I met them many, many times. But I've also met survivors of sexual violence in Republika Srpska, helping them to get justice being done and to have Bosnian or Croatian perpetrators being prosecuted. So for us, it's also extremely important that you can have a more privileged relationship to one group more than the other, because I met them 20 times, 30 times, 50 times, I don't know. But what is extremely important that for us as prosecutors, every single victim deserves justice. And any perpetrator who, from wherever he's coming, needs to be accountable for the crimes he allegedly has been committed. And this is really the message we also try to give as well. To be credible as a prosecutor, you have to apply the same rule and the same approach to any specific case.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brammertz, for talking to Al Jazeera Balkans.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.